Now, welcome back. The National Planning Commission, which is the custodian of the National Development Plan, is currently conducting a 10-year review of the country's economic growth and societal development under the NDP policy. Now, despite the positioning of the National Development Plan as the country's Vision 2030 blueprint, the NPC concedes that South Africa's development has been negative and that the country's economic trajectory has been gloomy. Now, growth has averaged 0.99% in the 10-year period, with the per capita GDP growth negative in 5 of the years under review. Now, South Africans are becoming poorer and the unemployment rate has increased to 33.9% officially. And these are some of the NPC's synopsis of the country's growth trajectory. Now, TU2 Vice-Chancellor Professor Tinyiko Maluleke is the Deputy Chairperson of the National Planning Commission, and he joins us virtually now to discuss this further. Professor, good to have you with us. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to the viewers.
So the NPC concedes that South Africa and the South African economy, and I put emphasis on the economy because a lot turns on that, it has not performed as expected. But looking at the past 10-year period, let's start with some of the gains. What do you think went well as far as the NDP, its implementation is concerned over the past 10 years?
Well, there are some things, Sakina, that have gone well. If you look, for example, in the social space, you will find that South Africa has made progress in the manner in which we managed COVID-19 to some extent. I mean, removed the corruption. The number of people with bachelor's degrees, as you know, the target set in the NDP, we've already surpassed that. There's been some progress in basic education. The quality of South African schooling as of 2022 was improving, not necessarily perfect, but improving at a very good rate. There was no target for child nutrition, for example, but there is concern that, there is persistence of under 5 stunting, which shows you that there are problems in that area. So there are some progress, but I think we have a lot more challenges and problems than progress.
Indeed. Just talking to the under 5 stunting, for example, Prof, 25% of South Africa's children under the age of 5 are actually stunted. Now, that does not make for good reading whichever way you look at it, because we have to look at what are the reasons for that.
Yeah, it's the underlying factor is poverty. I mean, 50% of South Africans are living in poverty. Let's face it, slightly more than, and I think that translates into that. There is, of course, vitamin A deficiency among African children, which again links to the question of poverty. So when we talk about people getting poorer, about poverty in South Africa, these things come into focus, into sharp focus, when we look at what is happening to children, just like you've just highlighted now. That's where it hits home, that there are many South Africans living in poverty.
But of course, this is something that the NDP was supposed to assist and try and alleviate in the country, because we've had that triple axis of poverty, unemployment and inequality with us for a very long time in this democracy. So in Vision 2030 that the NDP is supposed to facilitate, how have these improved, Prof? Because the unemployment rate has risen, poverty has increased, inequality has increased. So how does that translate then into an effective NDP?
Well, the NDP is a long-term plan. It is the only national long-term plan that we have. Like all plans, a plan is a destination. You decide where you want to go, and then you have markers along the way to tell how well you are doing in terms of the time that has been set and the targets that have been set. Now, the NDP is helpful insofar as it tells us now, as you and I are talking, where we have gone off course, where we are too slow, where we are not performing well, because we know what the norm ought to be. We know where we are going, as it were. That's really what the long-term plan is all about. Now, any plan, including a long-term plan, is as good as it is implemented. If you have it and you don't implement it, and implement it conscientiously, consistently, meticulously, then it becomes irrelevant. That's the reason we now have this 10-year review. We want to track and trace how consistent and how central the plan remains in everything that government is doing, but also in terms of where we want to take the country. In 2018 already, the previous National Planning Commission did a 5-year review. We want to build on that and take a broader look at the 10-year period ending in August 2022.
So let's take a look at some of the factors right from the beginning that were highlighted as the country's problems that needed urgent attention during the NDP's diagnosis of the country. And you've mentioned some of those, but let's hone in and just take a closer look, Professor. So education, you were talking about, bachelor's degrees, the quality of a basic education that has improved. Let's speak to that a little more discursively by way of example. How has it actually improved?
Well, the numbers have improved, definitely, but not necessarily the quality. And I hear where you are going. I mean, the quality does not always follow the numbers. And postgraduate education, even the numbers have not improved. So it's a partial success story. It's certainly by no means a complete success story. To the extent that many educated South Africans, including graduates, end up being unemployable for longer periods than necessary, to the extent that there are issues of ability to read and numeracy skills among the young. These are some of the things that indicate that the quality, there's still a lot of room for improvement as far as the quality is concerned. But all I'm saying is that there are a few green shoots. There are not too many, but they are there, and we ought not to ignore them completely, even as we focus on what still needs to be done. But education is a huge part of the employment problem in which we are, the mismatch between the skills that people come out with and the job market, for example. So there is quite a lot to be addressed there.
The problem, Prof, is that 10 years ago, we were talking about this very same mismatch between the education that's provided and what the actual industry requires. So it's really frustrating that we seem to be having the same conversations at different markers in this journey. Because, again, you talk about the quality of education, it's been constant. One of the other diagnoses that I wanted us to zoom in on was health. There's water, there's the energy crisis, and perhaps we could look at that one a little more closely as well, given where we find ourselves. There's spatial planning and rural development as examples. All of these, along with, again, poverty, unemployment, inequality, and of course the economy. And again, one is just desperate to see where there has been any meaningful improvement since the NDP has been introduced. I'm not saying there hasn't been any. I'm saying, where have we literally moved the needle in a way that speaks to significant improvement at this stage?
Well, you know, child support grant, for example, nearly 13 million children are being assisted in that way. The social grant system that we have put in place. And of course, these are double-edged swords, because you could argue that they are not sustainable. So there are some things that have worked well, but I don't think there is any room for complacency. You see, Sakina, the energy crisis that we're experiencing today, the load shedding, for example, it didn't just happen in 1 or 2 weeks or 1 month or just overnight. It is years, a decade, more than a decade of non-implementation and non-regard for a plan, for planning, even when the warning signs were put before government. So you end up in a situation that we are in, and that's why we need to constantly talk about it, even if it sounds like we're talking about the same thing, because these are the things that must be done ahead of success. You can't have success in the energy sector if 10 years ago you were warned about aging infrastructure, you were warned about a growing economy that will outpace our energy needs, and you didn't plan and implement accordingly. That's why we are where we are, and that's why we sound like a broken record, because we have got to talk about the same things again and again, because those things that ought to have been done were not done.
But I think, Prof, and you would appreciate that, given what South Africans are going through, objective realities at this stage, they want more than talk. You know, it's been more than 20 years of a lot of talk, and things need to improve. If you look at the previous NPC's reports acknowledging the country's bleak economic trajectory, for example, your statement also states that South African households have been seeing negative GDP growth per capita in 5 of the years under review. We spoke about the unemployment rate that has increased. Now, if the primary goal of the NDP, Prof, is to eliminate the poverty, to reduce the inequality, to reduce the unemployment by 2030, we are 7 years out. Is that deadline still realistic?
It may not be realistic, but it is a deadline that tells us how far off we are, and that tells us that gives us an indication of what we ought to be doing that we are not doing. And to that extent, it is useful. It's not completely without use. Now, Sakina, let's distinguish between the NDP and the NPC. The NDP is the property of all South Africans. I mean, the NPC may be custodian of it, but all South Africans ought to call government and all agencies responsible for its implementation to account. It belongs to all of us. The NPC, there's a reason why the NPC is called the National Planning Commission and not the National Implementation Commission. The implementation has to be done somewhere between government and those arms of government mandated with the implementation. What we as independent experts in the NPC do is to try and constantly conscientize government, not to think in 5-year terms, not to veer away from the plan, not to make it marginal to the overall planning of government, whether you're talking about the MSTF or you're talking about planning in the long term, so that we constantly go back to where we dreamed we want to go. I mean, if you read the NDP, it begins with a vision and a metaphor of a country in a journey. And 2030 at that time was sort of considered to be the destination. Our role is to constantly say, hey, this is the country we want to go to, and we are not going there if we neglect A, B, C, and D.
All right, Prof, of course we'll talk more about this, but for today, that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you so much for your time this morning. TUT Vice-Chancellor Professor Tinyiko Maluleke is also the Deputy Chairperson of the National Planning Commission, and talking about the review of the NDP. And if you want, you can also let us know your thoughts at Morning Live SABC.